everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's December 2019, and you're listening to episode 153 of Postmodern Realities, which is a conversation about truth, emotionalism, and faith. On this episode, I'm joined by Hilary Morgan Ferrer, who has a master's degree in biology and is the founder of the Apologetics organization, Mama Bear Apologetics. She is the co-author and general editor of the recently released book, Mama Bear Apologetics, and she is vice president of Women in Apologetics. Hilary has written an online exclusive feature article for the Christian Research Journal, and it's available for you to read free at our website, equip.org, and her article is called If I Feel It, It's True, Combating the Rise of Emotionalism. Hilary, it's good to have you on.
Thank you for having me, Melanie.
Well, our listeners might remember several years ago, the Oxford Dictionary named the word of the year, and that word was post-truth, which really means that objective facts aren't as important, specifically in the public square, as opposed to appeals to emotion, which is how people form their personal beliefs. So that has to do with Hilary's article. So why don't you unpack that for us? What is emotionalism?
So emotionalism is basically taking your emotions as your reasoning behind something is true. You're not looking as much at facts. You're not looking at much as at what actually happened. It's this idea that if, again, as the title of the article, if I feel it, it's true. We've seen this happen, even though I'm a big fan of the Me Too movement that's been going on, because I think there's a lot of wrongs that need to be corrected. But at the same time, there's some people jumping onto that bandwagon, turning it into, if I felt uncomfortable, then the person did something inappropriate. It could have been, I think the one that stands out in my mind was Garrison Keillor, who did Prairie Home Companion. He had a staff member who was crying, and I think he patted them on the back, and they said, that makes me uncomfortable. And he apologized. And he even sent a letter later saying that, apologized for making them uncomfortable. Well, now that everything's going on, they came forward in the media saying how uncomfortable that situation made them feel. And it ruined his career as if he had done something objectively wrong because someone subjectively felt something. Or one of the most recent ones that we've said with Greta Thunberg, when she was coming forward to the UN about climate change, that she didn't really specify all the things that were happening. Rather, it was this long kind of angry rant about how this had ruined her childhood and it's stolen her dreams. And ironically, the people that she was talking to aren't even, if you look at the data, they're not even the main ones that are causing what she felt was the cause, which is, all the pollution, all the man-made things. But everybody lauded it as this great step forward of a youth activist, when really all it was expressing a bunch of feelings and not really giving any concrete data. So that would be kind of the trend that I see happening in our country.
So where do you see this trend for emotionalism most at play in our culture, just where people are appealing to their feelings versus any kind of objective facts at all? I've seen this recently, actually, when I was listening to a podcast, and the person was saying that if you don't endorse, and this had nothing to do with anything political or theological, it was just a gaming podcast, actually. And they were basically saying, if you don't agree with my worldview, then you are dangerous. And you are not welcome to play any games with me. And if I knew that you voted a certain way or you believed a certain thing, then you are what's wrong in the world, which I was really taken aback by, because I was just thinking in terms of this person, because maybe they've had bad experiences, but their whole entire just worldview was based on, if I don't agree with you and you make me feel unsafe just by the very fact that you have specific beliefs and I don't know you, then I will not welcome you anywhere near my space. You're not even welcome to shake my hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's actually a really great quote by a guy named Noah Rothman. He has a book out called Unjust, The Rise of Social Justice in America. And he has a statement that really blew me away that I thought, ooh, that's exactly what I'm seeing. Or when it comes to really hot topics, maybe like the transgender topic or abortion, that what you'll see is people making statements on one side, so people exercising their free speech, and then the ones who don't like what they're saying coming in and physically attacking them. And one of the things that he says is it is increasingly common to hear social justice activists equate discomfiting or objectionable speech with acts of violence, and not just in a metaphorical sense. Since they conflate offensive speech and violence, a violent response to speech isn't just reasonable, it's necessary. It's practically self-defense. It's this idea, again, of taking something objective that has happened. If someone comes up and punches me in the face, that is an objectively violent act. Now, if I go somewhere and I hold a sign that says, value the preborn, if that makes them feel just as angry as if I'd punch them in the face, they'll come back and punch me in the face. And so it's like having a statement that they don't like, if that raises up emotions in them, then violence is like tit for tat. It's this concept of tit for tat, that now violence and words have become equally offensive, shall we say, or equally violent.
So, are there specifically, like you mentioned, certain issues, but are there specific groups of people or situations or institutions where emotionalism is coming to be more accepted or at least expressed?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones, and we won't go into all the details of this, but I think in politics is one of the places where I hear this happen a lot, where instead of claiming this is what this person did or this is what actually happened, they will characterize an action under something like racism or violence or bigotry or a bunch of different words, or discrimination, and say they acted as a bigot. And instead of saying what they did, they say the interpretation. You also see this on college campuses. And I don't know what's going on with college students right now of the inability to handle different ideas from their own. Like you see this with them having to have the safe spaces on campus. And ironically, even in the safe spaces, there's certain things you can't say in the safe space. So the safe space is basically taking away the right to speech for certain groups because that's not safe. And there was recently, it was either an article or on Facebook, I can't remember where it was. It was for a student that was in college that wrote a thank you letter to their professor and said, we are allowed to talk about things. Your classroom is a safer place to talk about things than in the safe space out there. In the safe space, we're not allowed to discuss these topics, but you actually give us a safe space in your classroom to discuss these topics. And I thought that that was very telling.
Yes, I was going to mention that example too, because I think we probably know the same person, and it was professor, and
Do you
they
remember
noted
who it
that.
was?
I recall that it was Dr. Frank Beckwith, Dr. Francis
Yes,
Beckwith,
you're
and he's
right, at
a
Baylor.
longtime writer for the Christian Research Journal, and it was neat. You know, I liked his status because I thought that was neat that he gave people room in which to talk about it. And I think that's the hard part, whatever the issue is, that sometimes there's not even the acknowledgement that we can talk about certain topics dispassionately. And I think that is not as good for the exchange of ideas if both sides of any issue, it doesn't have to be political, no matter what it is, if we cannot have in the public square reasonable discussions based on facts, then it does get to be definitely heated, unfortunately, at least in the United States, at least in Western cultures, I guess I'd say. So, what are the reasons for this growing appeal of emotionalism that we see out in our culture now?
I would think one of the big ones is this idea that implicit knowledge and that truth and morality actually exist, or that if they exist, then it's an objective standard. We talk about in the Mama Bear Apologetics book kind of the onset of postmodernism and how this idea of postmodernism, it looked at kind of how do we know what we know was one of the main questions. And so back in the previous, like in the pre-modern, in the modern time, how they knew what they knew to be absolutely true, like in the pre-modern times was if it was revelation from the gods or God. And as we see in Nancy Pearcey's book, where it talks about with the rise of religious wars, people started questioning, well, if none of these gods can agree, then we just need to take God out of the question. Any kind of divine revelation, that can't tell us what's true. The modern period brought on science of the only thing that we can actually know for true is something that we can either prove in the lab or prove with the scientific method. But that basically only deals with the physical realm. It doesn't deal with metaphysics, or it doesn't deal also with things that are immaterial. We need to have a way to determine if immaterial things are true or not, because, the idea of truth itself is not a physical thing. I can't put a little truth in a beaker and, see what happens. It's non-physical. So when we moved into postmodernism, they started to say, well, we couldn't know for certainty with religion. We can't know for certainty with science. So we're just going to say we can't know for certain, period. But the ironic thing that happened with that is I think people still have this knowledge that there is absolute truth that exists. And the reason why we can say people have this knowledge is because once you said that nobody can know for sure, then everybody started trying to convince everybody else that whatever was revealed to them subjectively was ultimately true and was ultimately real for everybody. And of course, we see this with the rise of slogans like, my truth, his truth, her truth. Anything that puts a possessive pronoun in front of truth is really modifying truth, when truth is not supposed to be modified. It's supposed to be something that you can compare to reality. So I think just that knowledge that these things exist, that there's an objective standard, I think is gone. But since people still want to be able to claim something's true, and the purpose of claiming something is true is so that they can get their way on something that makes me feel bad. And that's not always a bad thing. I think we should argue for objective truths that, like the rise of bullying. Like, good grief. When I was a kid, it was one of those things that was just kind of expected, which, there's a kind of level that you can't stop all bullying as kids. Kids are just mean. I'm sorry. They're just mean. And they're going to find a way to bully someone. But at the same time, I think as adults, we should reasonably try to stop something that is really obvious, kind of bullying, picking on the little kid on the playground, or now with social media, picking on other kids. So this new standard, bullying is wrong. Now we have to convince other people that it's wrong, but we can't appeal to a standard. So what we do is we appeal to story. We appeal to the people who have been affected by something. And again, I think in some ways that's legitimate. As I argue in the emotionalism chapter, both in the article and in the Mama Bear book, that I think that emotions can be really good indicators of something that's, true or false, as long as they're disciplined by reason, reality, and scripture. So again, it's this way of arguing for something as whether or not it's true or false. And when we get rid of the foundation of truth itself, then there's just a new way to argue for it. And now it's emotions.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest is Hilary Morgan Ferrer, and she has written an online exclusive feature article that's available completely free at our website, equip.org. And Hilary's article is called, If I Feel It, It's True, Combating the Rise of Emotionalism. I'd like to also invite you to subscribe to the Christian Research Journal. A subscription is $33.50, and you can subscribe by going to equip.org. In addition, we'd like to ask you to consider partnering with us with a gift at the end of the year. It's through your donations and your support, whether it's a subscription or donation or even a tip for this content, that helps keep bringing you all of this free content. Our website is not like other websites that provide a lot of information or articles. We have no paywall whatsoever, so you can access all of our videos, all of our audio, all of our podcasts, past journal articles completely free at our website, equip.org. Now, if a subscription is not in your budget, we'd like to ask you to consider giving us a tip. A tip would be $3 or $5 or a smaller amount. That you can do so if you go to the landing page for this episode. Simply go to equip.org, go to magazine, click the drop-down menu, go to Postmodern Realities Podcast, find the landing page for this episode or any past episodes, and there you'll find a link to be able to tip us for this content. So as the year comes to a close, since it is December, and you're considering all of your year-end charitable giving, would you please consider donating for the Christian Research Journal and the Postmodern Realities Podcast? And we thank you for your partnership. We're just kind of talking about the effects in culture that's coming about because of this new appeal to emotionalism trumping actual objective fact. So, are there any other worldviews I'd like to ask you that you think play into emotionalism?
I do, let's see, I think that definitely postmodernism is probably one of the big ones. I think that really paved the way. If we look at knowledge and truth, knowledge has been called justified true belief. But when postmodernism came along and we were told that there was no such thing as truth, people acted as if knowledge was still true, like they could still justify a truth belief. It's just what they justify it with. So there's this irrational bifurcation of two concepts that should go together. So I would say that postmodernism definitely goes along with that. I would say moral relativism being this idea that I can choose which of the morals I think are true. And so again, I'll say this is what's true for me. That's what's true for you. I think a person's own emotions are kind of becoming the way that they decide that. I think sometimes even in Marxism and the feminism, you see this at play too, because you're trying to rile people up almost to revolt. And so I think that those are kind of capitalizing on the fact that now that we've changed how someone can determine and how someone can explain to us what is true, now we've capitalized that in whatever direction that we want. So those are some of the specific ones that I address in the book that I think are all being affected.
So, you just mentioned postmodernism as one of the worldviews. So, it's sounding like there is components of emotionalism, of that, post-truth emotionalism, that are similar to postmodernism. So, are there any differences between those particular worldviews?
I would say the main difference is I think with an emotionalism, you think that objective truth actually does exist. It's just determined by something else versus a true postmodernist will say, well, nobody really knows for sure. And so it's like emotionalism is kind of what happens after someone has already had that road paved for the traditional ways of knowledge to be known as true. So again, I think that someone who's really operating under emotionalism still acts as if things are true versus the true postmodernist is really more of a philosophical position to where they're just not going to say it's true or all. And again, with emotionalism, the only way to get someone to believe something is true is getting them to feel something as strongly as you do. And so while postmodernism might say, hey, let's all kind of experience everybody's truths, emotionalism is going to go a step further and say, I need other people to not only experience my truth, but feel as strongly as I am. So now that it becomes their truth. And again, that's essentially what we did back in the day with just the concept of any truth, that you did want to convince people that truth was true. And you used reason, you used all these different things to convince them. But now if you're trying to use emotions, you're using things like story, which again, I'm not going to say is a bad thing. It's kind of the rise. I remember someone close to me being really sick and they were looking at some of the, well, we'll say they were researching, quote unquote, different kind of treatment plans, but instead of looking at research statistics, they were looking at testimonials. And it was this idea of like, oh, these other people really experienced this, and now it's making me hoping I'll experience that same thing. But a testimonial doesn't tell you how many people tried this treatment. It just tells you that this one person actually experienced a good experience from it. Or sometimes what you see in the protests, I think the protests are a big one. I think back to one of my childhood favorite movies, which was the movie Newsies. Did you watch that when you were a kid?
I did never got onto the Newsies bandwagon. I know it's been made into a Broadway show and everything. I'm surprised I didn't, but no, I never
No,
did.
that was Christian Bale. I think it was an all male cast except for one girl. So my sister and I were like, woo, we love that movie. But they had objective things that they were protesting against. This is when you had the children who were peddling the news. A lot of times these children were either runaways or orphans. And when I think it was Pulitzer and Hearst started charging them more for the paper, then they had to sell for the same price. And so they weren't making any money. They could barely get by as it was. And so when they protest, their demands were something that could be met. Now, fast forward to the protests that you see happening within the last 10 years. Think about the Occupy Wall Street. Can you think of what an actual demand was from them?
Oh, I don't recall, no.
Yeah, I don't think they were able to get a good answer. And there was the protest, the March for Women, where I think there was a girl, Summer Yeager, who went out and interviewed a bunch of people asking them what their demands were. And the demand was to get rid of the patriarchy. And she was saying, well, how do you know when they're gone? And what is the patriarchy? Who is the patriarchy? Can you point me in their direction? And again, it's this vague kind of emotional concept that you can't actually measure. So you can't even tell if a protest is successful or not. What exactly are you protesting? You're protesting a concept. I mean, how do you know when your demands have been met?
Now, I want to ask you this question because a few years ago, we published an article called Communicating Truth Through Humor, Ridicule, and Emotions. And our listeners, if you want to go to our website, equip.org, you can read it up there. It's up there for free for you to read. So I want to ask you, in light of that, because we did posit that there's a time that you can communicate truth through emotions, is there a time when emotionalism is a good thing?
Oh, absolutely. I think when we're dealing with actual injustices, because I think there's a lot of things that we know in our head is true, but unless we kind of know it in our head and we're in our heart, then we're not really moved to act. So, for an example, I think documentaries are really good, especially ones that I've seen recently that are dealing with, we'll say, the sex trade. The sex trade is one of those things that I think we can all agree is just objectively wrong, and there's something we need to be doing about this. Now, I can know in my head, yes, that is objectively wrong. But until I kind of see those stories, until I hear from the people who have been affected by this, I'm not going to fully understand how horrific this is. And once I do fully understand, then I'm going to be moved to action. So it might be something I either give money to an organization that is helping these girls out of trafficking, or I donate maybe my time to helping them. So I think emotions are a really powerful thing within marriage. If our husbands came to us like Spock and say, "Hey, I think this is a good idea and you're perfectly adequate, will you marry me?" That's like the worst proposal ever. You want there to be emotions. Emotions are the things that help you protect your children. In fact, Mama Bear Apologetics capitalizes on the idea that women have an emotional protective instinct towards their children. If you look at every great, like a lot of the great battle movies that have been throughout time, these are the ones that the guys gravitate towards, something like Braveheart. It all starts with something highly emotional, like killing his beloved, that moves him to action, something where, he knew that there was this war going on. He knew that they were trying to take away the Scotsman's freedom. But when he was actually just emotionally enraged at something that they did, that is when he was moved to act. So again, I think that having that empathetic response, will say seeing a bully on the playground, a kid that really has a strong empathy, that sees a bully on the playground with another little kid that can't defend themselves. If that makes you angry, then good. It should make you angry. And if that moves you to act, of course, we want it to act in a reasonable way, then that's good. I think lots of emotions, as long as they are based on, again, truth, scripture, and reality, can move people to act in really good and healthy ways that they may not have been moved to action before. In fact, I think emotionalism would have no place if we didn't know that there was things that we were supposed to be angry about. But it's when you then slap a label on it to make people feel the emotions without giving them the facts. That's when you start getting the unhealthy. But in terms of just emotionalism in general, we are emotional beings. And I think the Lord uses our emotions for good. And I have no problem with that.
So, when did you first start looking into this whole issue of a worldview that is based on emotionalism?
When we started writing the Mama Bear Apologetics book, so first we were actually approached by Harvest House and said, we would like a book from you, or I was anyway, and I decided I want to make this a group project. I want to bring my other Mama Bears in on this. And so we took this concept that there are worldviews out there that are actively undermining our children's ability to have faith. And we said, what are the main ones that are out there? And one of the things that I noticed is that the church has been using the concept of, I think, emotionalism in somewhat healthy way, but still maybe not necessarily always a good way, through this idea of testimony. What is the testimony of how God has changed my life? Well, now what we're starting to see is that when I would go to, we'll say, like atheist debates with John, or atheist conferences, they started having people giving kind of anti-testimonies where they stood up and they started saying all the abuses that they had experienced in the hands of Christians at particular churches. And what I realized was this is kind of where I think the church had kind of gone wrong for a while. that they had tried to give testimony and use it as, this is how I know that this is true. It's basically kind of a glorified pragmatism. This worked for me. But if we want to use it, if the church wants to use it in that way, and now we've trained an entire generation of kids to say, if you hear this testimony, that means this is true. I don't know why it didn't occur to us that now they're going to go out somewhere else and someone's going to give a completely different testimony for a completely unbiblical concept. And the kids are going to say, well, that's how I knew what was true in church. Well, I guess I can know this thing over here is true. There's a really strong personal testimony on that. So that actually became one of the ones that we started saying, okay, this is one of the things that is undermining kids' ability to have faith, is they don't know how to distinguish good arguments for something being true. And again, I don't think the church even has it. If you look back in the first century, the arguments that they had for something being true was, we have eyewitnesses who were there, who saw this Christ guy die, and who witnessed him rising again. That was a first century testimony right there. And all the changes that happened from then on were almost, I won't say they were a moot point, but they didn't have anything to do with the truthfulness of the story. And so, so that was one of the things we wanted to say. What is going on with your youth? Why are we witnessing this mass youth exodus from the church? And emotionalism, that was one of the ones that we landed on as being a major culprit.
I do want to tell our listeners, she mentioned going to debates with John. John would be her husband, Dr. John Ferrer, who has written for the Christian Research Journal, and you can find his articles free online on our website. One of the most recent ones that he did was a movie review of the documentary film Hail Satan, and he's also written an article about recognizing occultism in your church. Well, I want to ask you, how should Christians respond to emotionalism? Because it's interesting. I was in a online conversation with someone, who's very not hostile at all. They're an atheist and so forth. So I was saying, well, certainly when people get together to do something innocuous, like play a game together, there's certain, can't we just all agree on something like, gravity or 2 + 2 = 4? And he said, no, not everyone believes that. So it's like, I couldn't even,
wow.
How do you even start engaging? Not that he didn't, but that he was saying, yeah, there are people out there that don't even agree with that. Of course, there are people who believe the world is flat. That's a thing now. So I thought, okay, but I mean, there's certain things that we learned as objective facts in school, that 2 + 2 = 4. And maybe people are rejecting that now. But as far as I know, whether you go to public school or homeschool or private school, you are learning your basic math facts that you have to, memorize, little kids. But yet here's someone is saying, I don't know if there's ways for people who are really far apart in their worldviews to even agree that gravity exists. So if we're into that situation where it's emotionalism, like, I can't, for whatever reason, believe that 2 + 2 = 4, there might be some reason, like I hated math as a kid or whatever. I'm not trying to be snarky. I mean, I'm trying to be really serious. Like they could not even agree with me that there's something that's factual, that's outside of ourselves, that we can all agree on. And he wouldn't even say that there's that. So how should Christians even respond to emotionalism? How should we even bridge that gap? How do we answer that? Because we want to be able to interact with people of different worldviews and be able to, have relationships with people in our families and our neighborhoods and wherever else we're at work. So how do we even broach this? It seems like the gap is so wide.
Oh, yeah. So that's interesting. I haven't met someone who was so committed to this that they wouldn't even acknowledge that 2 + 2 = 4. And I think that's an interesting to say, I don't believe 2 + 2 = 4 because I hated math. Again, that would be an emotionalistic argument for something. Because I hated something, therefore I can't trust it. So I would define emotions inherently. There's kind of, and I'm going to use these terms really loosely, rational and irrational emotions. And we're always going to experience both. I think emotions a lot of times can be inherently irrational. A person feels what they feel, and sometimes they're aware that this doesn't match reality. So let's take the rational emotions. I think this is one of the things we need to teach our kids, to explore their emotions and to kind of fact check their emotions and to gauge where these emotions coming from. So as Christians, I think this is something we should hold each other accountable to where if someone's feeling something really strongly, to just very lovingly talk about, okay, kind of the Greg Koukl, how did you come to that conclusion? Because one of the things that we talk about in the book is that there's a difference between emotions and passions. There's a book called Not Passion's Slave by a guy named Robert Solomon. And he talks about how passions are kind of that emotion that you can't control versus emotions can be a type of judgment. And I can't remember if he came up with this example or we did. The idea that if you were in high school, or we'll say you're middle school, you can't drive and you're waiting for your mom after school and you wait and you wait and you wait and you are just fuming mad because it's like, she is the worst mother ever. She has forgotten me. She's made me wait this whole time. And then your dad comes screeching up and says, quick, get in the car. Your mother's been in an accident. Your emotion of anger towards her changes on a dime because you have made the judgment that she is acting this way because of XYZ, because she's a bad mom, because she's forgetful, because she's selfish, whatever you want to say, whatever your middle school reasoning is. So helping people understand what is kind of a rational emotion versus irrational emotion. And the rational ones, again, I would say if you see a true injustice happening, that you have that rational emotion versus if you just feel something really strongly, but someone can't say why, start to look at that. And as Christians, I think we should hold each other accountable to it. And I think we need to be teaching this to our kids because I can guarantee that the world is not teaching your kids this process. They are applauding them when they come forward with bravely and loudly expressing their truth. The world will applaud them for this. But we as Christians and we as parents need to be teaching our kids not all emotions is it brave and is it laudable to express. We need to analyze those emotions first. And so I think that's one way we can start to combat it. And there's one more thing that I like to say to my mama bears a lot, and this is something that I've just learned through experience, is I have encountered people where there is something inherently completely illogical going on, where they are reacting in a way that really makes no logical sense from what I can tell. And when you see such an irrational stronghold like this, I think a lot of times that's a cue that you have something spiritual going on. And in that sense, when we see that kind of emotionalism going on, where there is no talking reason, there is no having a conversation, they believe what they believe and they don't even want to hear what you have to say, or maybe it's even just misinterpreting everything that's going on to fit some narrative that they have in their head. That when you see that going on, this is a different kind of battle than one that needs to have a debate. That's a spiritual battle. And so I think that's another way we as Christians can respond is prayer.
I think that's a good word. I was earlier this year involved in just a conversation in a Facebook group about this idea of let's all get together, no matter who you are, let's all play a game together. Speaking of board games. And so I mentioned that, it doesn't matter what anyone believes, how they self-identify. I don't know any of that. We're sitting down together, maybe at a convention or some other game store or something like that. And let's all play a game together. And a lady came on and was so visceral in her hate. I mean, even people who I think were progressive and not Christians are like, wow, like your hate. It was just like, if you're a conservative, if I even knew that you were, then you basically, she said, you need to die. Like we need to kill half of it. And it was so, I had never experienced, I didn't even say that I was a Christian in this scenario. I was just saying, hey, let's, build a bridge, make a friend. Let's all, play a game together. And the visceralness of that hate that was even noticed by other people, and this is a fairly large group of several thousand people, I thought was just very fascinating. It was a little unnerving because when I tried to get back, and it was a lot of profanities and just hate on, like half the people in the United States need to go away and all this kind of stuff. I just tried to get back to the thing of, well, does that really matter? Like, well, how does that matter when I don't know what you believe? I'm just sitting down at a table with you and we're going to play, I don't know, Scrabble or something. I think that the whole entire just experience was quite unnerving, that there are so many people that have sat in these emotions that they're viscerally angry and hateful towards others. So I thought it was interesting in the discussion that even other people who are not religious by a long shot felt that this person was being quite hateful and just over the top. So I think that there are real people out there like that. I've experienced that personally on the internet.
You
in
could see this
quote
with
unquote what I thought was a safe space. Like I'm in this group because we all, enjoy playing a board game, and then someone to come, and I, didn't mention my beliefs at all, but someone to come with that kind of visceral reaction that was quite emotional was fascinating.
Mhm. All the comments that I saw happening a couple weeks ago, when it was either a couple weeks ago or months ago, I have no concept of time anymore. But when George Bush and Ellen DeGeneres were
Oh
sitting next
yeah,
to each
I
other.
saw that. Yeah, that was really interesting. I didn't end up. I almost thought about posting about it, but nothing ever can be dispassionately discussed on the internet, as we all know. Plus, no one can ever. That's the thing. That's why you can't ever change mind. You're not going to change somebody's mind on the internet. You have to have a relationship with them, and I think that that's certain hobbies bring that together. I mean, if you all like a certain sports team, shouldn't you be
Yeah.
able to go and watch a game together with your neighbors? If you're all rooting for the same team, does it matter if you're a Christian or you voted a certain way? So I did think that Ellen DeGeneres thing where they showed her sitting next to George W. Bush in like a skybox of
Hmm.
um,
I think it was the Cowboys.
something like that. Yeah, the Cowboys, because he lives in Texas and she was there with her wife and they were watching this thing. And then people just basically was like, let almost cancel culture type of thing. Let's no one wants Ellen DeGeneres anymore, and here's why she was wrong. And actually, come to think of it, I might have posted something on my Facebook page because I just said I don't agree with this. There was a long article in some, not a blog, but an actual publication online, and I posted why I didn't agree with that op-ed piece because I said we should be able to come together. We should be able to go to a neighborhood party. We should be able to go to a company party with people of different
Hmm.
beliefs. We should be
Absolutely.
able to, watch a game like they were watching the Cowboys. And if we don't, our Western culture and the United States and it's not just the United States, it's happening in the UK as well over political things there too. But, how can we really get to know our neighbors, our friends, other people, parents, families who go to our schools if we demand that everyone has to believe everything that we do, otherwise we can't even speak to them? I think that is a really narrow way in which we do these kinds of things. And it's unfortunate because I think that's the beauty of having a society where we are pluralistic in the sense that, we have all kinds of different people and we should welcome and be friends with all different kinds of people. But those kinds of attitudes are not very helpful, whichever side you identify with of any particular view. This is really interesting. I want to bring this up before I ask you another question finally about how this relates to sharing Christ, because we're kind of talking about that right now. If you can't even
Yeah.
have a relationship with people, how are you going to be able to, fulfill the Great Commission, to be able to get to have friends that don't have the same views as you, to be able to share the gospel? Because that's really what Christians, that's what it's about. We know that we're here, we're kingdom disciples, we should be sharing Christ. And just this last week, I heard on NPR there is a podcast that they have called The Hidden Brain. And the guy that hosts that, Shankar Vedantam, was talking about how emotions transform our thinking into ways that we don't think like we would think that we would act one way, but we don't act that way in the situation. So they just talked about how emotions are really interesting in that you don't have any memory of what you did that caused an intense emotion. So they gave the example of running. So you're like going up a really steep hill. This is research, the scientific researcher said, and you're just the emotion of the pain and all of this kind of stuff is just overwhelming you. But then when you're running down the other side of the hill where it's like, easy going, you don't remember all that pain that you had before. That
Mm.
could probably be the same thing for childbearing in
I
terms
was
of.
about to say childbirth. That sounds like childbirth.
But the interesting thing that they did in this research, so I do commend people to listen to it because it's just fascinating about the science about how emotions and how our perceptions of emotions are probably not even true scientifically. So they did this whole study where they had women, they said, now speaking of sexual harassment, they had them read a script of a job interview. And then the interviewer started asking increasingly uncomfortable questions. So they're reading this like, What would
Yeah.
you do if they asked you, oh, do you have a boyfriend? Or has anyone said you're pretty? And then they got into like more and more uncomfortable questions. And so every woman said, and like half of them or a huge majority said, oh, I would be so angry. I would walk out. I would tell them off. And then they took those same people and they didn't realize that it was part of this study. So somehow it was might have been people who were also job searching and put them in the actual interview.
Mm.
And the person started asking those very same questions and not a single person walked out. And at the end, when they were interviewed, they didn't feel the anger they did when they read that. What they felt was fear. So
Mm.
their response was completely different. So that just goes to show us that our emotions have just these wild, swingy, just effects on us, as opposed to trying to deal with something that is objective or that we think is objective, like 2 + 2 = 4, which, supposedly is objective, but we don't know these days. So I thought that was really, really interesting. So I would recommend that people look that up. It's the Hidden Brain podcast. It's hosted by Shankar Vedantam, who's an NPR reporter, and it's the December 2nd, 2019. It's about an hour long. So it's really fascinating if you want to just see how emotions really affect you and do they really, and how they might cloud your judgment or affect your judgment and you don't really even know it. So that's very interesting when we've had this whole discussion. But then finally, how does this impact sharing the gospel with people? Because like I said, I mean, of course we don't go into relationships. No one wants to be a project. Oh, I'm going to make a friend with this neighbor because I'm going to share the gospel. I mean,
Mhm.
the reason why we share the gospel is because Christ is the most important thing in our life. That would be true if something else was the most important thing in our lives. If someone got a job that they loved or was marrying somebody that they cared about, they would tell everybody about that person or about their job. Or if they have a child that becomes the most important thing to them, they would talk about their child all the time. So it should be natural for us to want to talk to people about Christ. We know it's the truth, not just the fact that he's said that we need to tell others about him, but that should just be a natural part of who we are. People should know that we're Christians and we identify as Christians. So how does this impact us as we go into those situations where sharing the gospel should be a natural part of who we are with people who aren't Christians?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, just talking about, because ultimately, no matter what we do in apologetics and in research, it should ultimately be coming back to what is the most important thing. And the most important thing is that people know who Christ is. And so I think this does impact our view of the Great Commission in the sense that, number one, I think it was interesting what you were saying, that little experiment that what they did, the women, when they were in the pseudo situation, felt anger, but when they were in the actual situation, they felt fear. And this kind of goes into a concept that I don't think we go into quite enough, which is the concept of fight or flight, which it can actually be fight, flight, or freeze right now, which is an actual biological response. And I think what is happening, especially within emotionalism, is people are getting into this fight or flight stage a lot easier than they used to be. And so one of the things that I think is really good when you're talking with someone, I have this slide in a presentation that I do. It's along the lines of, like, when you say the word Jesus, you don't know what they're picturing. And there's one person who's picturing this, nice guy petting a lamb. And the other one looks like this face of rage. It's like someone created a picture of Jesus with this face of rage. And so when you say that name, Jesus, you don't know what that's attached to. You don't know if they had a background where it was hellfire and brimstone. And, if you say the name of Jesus, it's like he is looking out for everything you do wrong. I have a family member who has come straight out and said that Jesus has always been this person who was just waiting to squash them under his thumb. And so when you start sharing the love of a guy who's waiting to squash you under his thumb, that's a different experience than us who maybe have experienced the love and the grace and the mercy of Jesus. So I think being aware of the signs of when someone has slipped into fight or flight, when you start seeing them kind of get shifty, when you start seeing them get tense in the face, when you start seeing them kind of breathing in a little bit heavier, that if you see them slipping into this place, I think one of the things that make women really good at apologetics, which has been underappreciated in the past, is being able to see these visual cues and diffuse situations. It's like it didn't used to be that there was not as much baggage attached to the name of Christian and attached to the name of Jesus in the past, I don't think, as there is now. But we can't ignore that there's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of people who either say straight up lies about Christians and Christianity, or that there's people, say, like the Westboro Baptist Church, that go out and really legitimately give Christians a bad name. So being able to watch what's going on and helping diffuse someone if they're getting into an uncomfortable situation. You mentioned before, I think, the use of humor. Humor is the great universal tension cutter. And being able to bring in a little bit of humor, also being another way that this is really helpful, some self-deprecating humor. Because again, if this person has experienced, Christians are just sitting there to judge you. And what you do is you kind of make a joke about yourself. What you're saying is, I'm not taking myself that seriously. I'm not holding myself up as the standard. And therefore, we can laugh at our shared humanity, and all of a sudden that tension goes down. Secondly, I think with emotionalism, finding the people who they truly, truly believe that emotions are the way to determine truth. And if that is the way that they have committed, that's their epistemological reality, and that's their epistemological method in general, well, then be aware of that and be able to talk about how, even if it's uncomfortable, even if you're not a super touchy-feely person, which I'm a lot of times not, being able to talk about Christ in a way that they can see how this is, it's a really powerful story. And we don't have to have that, I was saved from drug banging and prostitution, and now I'm in this wonderful family. We don't always have to have that story to have a powerful testimony. There are things that have happened to us that are powerful. And if that's how the person is trying to communicate with everything else, we should take that as a cue of, that's how I should try to communicate this to them. I think that everything that we learn about worldview, everything we learn about persuasion and tactics should be utilized to help communicate to a person with the language they already use. And this is kind of what we see Paul doing when he says, oh, I want to praise you for how religious you are, and I see you have this temple to an unknown God. He's using what they already know and using what their language already is to then try to bring Christ to them. And so I think the more that we can be savvy about how people think, how they come to decisions, how they make conclusions, the more savvy we can be to that, I think the more persuasive we can be. And likewise, when we see them getting really uncomfortable and we see them going into that fight or flight situation, that we know how to diffuse it, because once that fight or flight is activated, the rational brain cannot think clearly. And we want them in a place not where they're being manipulated into believing something, but where they are clearly seeing the truth of something. And so being able to take away that instinctual feeling of fight or flight, I think diffusing that's another way to where the truth of Christ can penetrate, because I think that the enemy works really strongly when people are in that irrational state, because we serve a God of reason. We serve a God who's reasonable, who's rational, who's not going to come barging in and forcing anything on anyone. We want to get them out of that state, and the enemy loves to keep people in a state of fight or flight. So take them back out of that, and the truth of Christ can permeate in a way that it may not have been able to permeate before.
Well, this is why we have to go with what you mentioned before, which is specifically praying a lot about this, especially in relationships with others. That's very important. Well, finally, I want to end with some fun rapid fire questions for Hillary. So Hillary, I know that it's cold and snows where you live. So on a cold winter night, hot tea, hot cocoa, or coffee?
Oh, definitely tea. I love tea. And especially right now, I'm having to do throat coat ever since I recorded the audiobook. And sometimes I do, when we had a bunch of interviews for the book, my throat's been going out. So I'm just living off of throat coat tea right now.
So introvert or extrovert?
Definitely extrovert. Although I'm learning to be more introverted. It's kind of surprising me. I don't know if it's because I'm becoming more like John, or if I'm legitimately becoming just introverted on my own now, doing all the research.
And do you know how to change a tire?
I have changed a tire once in high school. I think I would, so I know how. Would I do it? No, I would wait for AAA or John.
So highly scheduled and organized, or spontaneous and go with the flow?
Oh God, I wish I were scheduled and organized, but I'm not. I go with the flow. I'm very adaptable. It's great, but my desk is a mess. And if someone says, "What do you need from us in advance?" it'll take quite a while for me to figure that out.
And what's something on your bucket list?
Ooh, I think the one big thing has always been, I would love to live in Greece for at least 6 months.
Well, thanks, Hillary, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest has been Hilary Morgan Ferrer. Hilary has written an online exclusive feature article that's available for you to read completely free at our website, equip.org, and her article is called, If I Feel It, It's True, Combating the Rise of Emotionalism. We'd like to hear from you, so connect with us on social media, like the Bible Answer Man Facebook page, and follow CRI, Christian Research Journal, Hank Hanegraaff, and the Bible Answer Man on Twitter. And please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man channel on YouTube. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Postmodern Realities podcast on iTunes, and please rate and review our podcast. When you rate and review our podcast, it helps others see our content. And please share this episode on your social media accounts. Be sure you tune in daily to the Bible Answer Man broadcast hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff, who answers your questions live on air. To ask Hank a question, call 888-ASK-HANK, Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. In addition, head to iTunes and subscribe to Hank Unplugged, Hank's audio podcast. Follow Hank Off the Grid, where he has in-depth conversations with some of the brightest minds discussing topics you care about. So until our next Christian Research Journal author conversation, thanks for listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast.